Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Westminster Theological Center in the UK, and I am co-host of the podcast with Aaron Heim of Denver Seminary, Matthew Bates of Quincy University in Illinois, and Drew Johnson of the King's College in New York City. And for this episode, we have Professor Carol Newsom of Emory University, and she is an absolutely superb scholar and person, and well worth listening to. And if you've never read anything she's written, please go find something and read it. She's very thought-provoking and brings together a range of expertise that's really unmatched in the field. She's one of the leading scholars of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, and is a wonderful supervisor, teacher, and mentor to a lot of students. Special thanks for this episode go to Ed Hatke for his expert production skills in taking what are often difficult sound files and making something listenable out of them. And I want to thank Tommy Molman for his expert leadership in social media, and to Paul Young as well for his help in that area. Thank you to both of you. Okay, on to the episode. Hey, OnScript listeners, I'm here today with Professor Carol Newsom of Emory University and Candler School of Theology in Atlanta to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, climate change in the Bible, biblical and post-biblical concepts of the self, and a bunch of other cool stuff that Carol has worked on in the course of her illustrious career. Carol, thank you for your time and welcome to OnScript.
Thank you for inviting me.
Carol is Charles Howard Candler Professor of Old Testament at Candler School of Theology, which is at Emory University in Atlanta. I did my PhD at Emory, by the way, and had the privilege of taking courses with Carol, and I highly recommend them. In addition to authoring numerous books on Job, Daniel, and identity at Qumran, Carol is the co-editor of the Women's Bible Commentary, which is now in its 4th edition, I believe. And she produced a critical edition of the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And she was translator of 1Q Hodayot for one of the Dead Sea Scrolls critical editions. She also has 3 honorary doctorates and is a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and I could go on. First of all, Carol, how did you manage to resist the pull to stay in one scholarly lane throughout your career?
Oh, do you mean in terms of my research?
Yeah, you've done so many, you've worked in so many fields.
I've always said that I'm just easily bored. And so at a certain point, I keep thinking, something else would be fun now. But I have had 2 or 3 interests that I've thought would be fun to pursue. And so I've just decided from time to time to do that.
Yeah, so, early on in your career, you began sort of studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what was it that first piqued your interest in the study of the scrolls?
Well, it's funny. I actually went to graduate school because I was interested in the connection of Assyriology in the Bible. And so it was the very earliest material that I was interested in. And just by happenstance, took a course sort of to fulfill a distribution requirement on Second Temple Judaism. And at the time, there was very little research going on with a lot of the pseudepigraphical books, the non-canonical materials. And I thought, oh, wow, this stuff is just so cool, and yet nobody's working on it. So gradually, I found my interest just sort of drifting later and later until I ended up in really that the Second Temple period and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there were 2 professors on the faculty who had been members of the original team of 6 editors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so, it just created a certain opportunity.
So who did you take that class with that piqued your interest?
That was with John Strugnell, who eventually became my dissertation director. So it just opened my eyes to things that I hadn't seen before.
And you said that looking at this non-canonical Dead Sea Scrolls material was so cool. What was it that attracted you to it?
Well, initially, what I stumbled onto was the Book of Enoch, which, of course, retells in the first part of the Book of Enoch. It retells parts of Genesis, especially Genesis 6, the lead up to the flood story. And I had never encountered this before. And so here were, an elaborated story about the angels mating with human women and the birth of the giants. And I just thought, oh my, whoever knew that this stuff existed out there? And so I started getting interested in that. And then that led on to, of course, fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so once again, it was sort of, ooh, there's cool stuff here, and not many people know about it.
Yeah, and I think it's easy for people to think that, once the scrolls were discovered in 48 to 49 in the early 50s, that they had a kind of immediate impact in the field, and really it wasn't until much later when these were kind of fully digested and understood. So would you say you were kind of working at the beginning of that digestion process by biblical scholars?
Yeah, I ended up being in the right place at the right time. There was a big controversy about the slow pace of publishing the scrolls. And I think it's a little more complicated than people realize. Part of the problem was that, as so many things, the original team of 6 was supposed to just stay in place in Jerusalem until they got all their work done, but money ran out, and so they had to go take teaching jobs. And then after the big pieces were published, the little fragments were posed immense difficulties. And basically, the team was too small, but they didn't have a mechanism in place for recruiting new scholars. And so, for better or for worse, some of the team members started looking to their own graduate students. And I was the first graduate student that John Strugnell asked to take on the publication of some of the scrolls. And so I was really, like I say, fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time.
Now, who's the other of the 6 that was at Harvard at that time?
That was Frank Cross, and he worked primarily on the biblical manuscripts, and Strugnell worked mostly on the non-biblical manuscripts.
I have a different question about your early work at Harvard, and I'm curious what it was like doing research and scholarship in a male-dominated field.
Yeah, it really it was. Now, I was very fortunate in that people were just beginning to wake up to the notion that, oh my goodness, we really ought to have women in the program, and let's be on the lookout for some likely people. So I usually had mentors and champions who encouraged me, not only Cross and Strugnell, but also Paul Hansen. In fact, Paul Hansen was very helpful in my getting my first job. So I was really fortunate in that instead of having roadblocks, I generally had people who were helping me. But it was a little odd in that, it was just customary. I'd walk into a class and I'd be, the only woman or one of 2 women. And so just a little different.
Yeah, it's quite different than my experience at Emory in the graduate program. So after you produced a critical edition of Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, how did you go about discerning your next research area?
Yeah, there was some work that I really wanted to follow up a little bit with some of the scroll work, but honestly, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next, and I think in those days, the pace of expectations was a little slower, and so I was able to take a little time and look around. But primarily what happened was that once I started teaching, I was assigned to teach things that I'd never had any interest in before, like the wisdom literature. And so in teaching the course, I kept thinking, "Whoa, wow, the book of Job is really interesting." And so as I finished up some of the work on the scrolls, I began to think, "Oh, it'd be wonderful if I could do some focused work on Job." And when I was invited to contribute to a commentary series, I said, "Only if I get to do the book of Job." So that was, again, another fortuitous opportunity to just pursue an interest that was emerging out of my teaching. And I think for a lot of people, you think you know what you want to do, but when you start teaching material, you discover interests you didn't even know you had.
Yeah, I've definitely found that to be the case. And so so that was for the New Interpreter's Bible commentary, is that right? Is that the
right.
one? It was,
Okay. That's right.
And so you produced that commentary, and then you also went on to write another book on, or a monograph on Job. And I'm curious how your understanding of Job shifted from the commentary to your book, Job and the Contest of Moral Imaginations.
Yeah. Well, this also involves the story of I should call it a failed book, although eventually I did produce it after 15 years. Following up on the Dead Sea Scrolls work, I was actually trying to do a theoretical piece on using rhetoric and certain postmodern understandings of how language works to talk about sectarian discourse. And so I started reading the work of Mikhail Bakhtin. Well, my project on the Dead Sea Scrolls, it got too confusing, and so I dropped it for a while. But all of a sudden I realized, oh my goodness, Bakhtin's theory of how language is really about dialogue, not just explicit, but even implicitly is always about dialogue. And I thought, that's what I need to work on the book of Job, because this is a book that is fundamentally about dialogues, both successful and failed dialogues. So actually the research I was doing for the scrolls opened up the key to working on Job. And you can't put a bunch of theory in a commentary that's designed for a general public, but the basic insights were in the commentary. But then I realized, my scholarly friends are not going to catch what the theoretical bases are that I'm actually working from unless I write that material up in a different form. So doing the monograph was kind of the sort of the unfinished business of making explicit what was implicit in the commentary. And I did finally go back and finish that Qumran book.
Yeah, that's interesting because I remember one time, I hadn't thought about this till now. You were on a review panel. It was one of those commentary review panels that happen at SBL. And I remember you talking about the fact that often scholars will bury what should be a monograph within a commentary, and they'll publish a commentary when they should have published a monograph. So that's probably coming out of your own experience, isn't it?
In part, yes. I mean, in my case, they were for two different audiences. And so I did try to keep those tasks separate. But yeah, I think that we oftentimes, I think biblical scholarship, we invest too much time and energy in commentary writing, because in order to write a good commentary for an audience, you have to include so much of material that is not new to scholarship, but it may be new to the person who's reading the commentary. So you have to repeat a lot that's known. Monographs and articles are really the venue for exploring new territory. And I think that the field is better off if we do more of that exploratory writing. We're kind of duplicating each other too much right now, I think, in writing commentary.
So did you feel that tension when you worked on your recent Daniel commentary?
I did. I kept thinking, I'm not sure the world needs another one of these. And so it was difficult to think, okay, since I had already agreed to do this, how do we make this something that serves its audience but breaks a little new ground? And actually, the way I did that was by enlisting a bright young scholar, Brennan Breed, who's interested in the reception history of biblical materials. And so he wrote these brilliant essays on what happens to the interpretation of Daniel in later history. And so I look back and I think, okay, I did a competent job on laying out issues in Daniel. But what I think is the real interesting contribution there is the fact that we integrate those reception history essays.
One of the themes that emerges perhaps most clearly in your teaching, although in your writing as well, is a consistent interest in environmental care. And you even teach a course, I believe, called The Bible and Care for the Earth at Candler. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
What resources do you think the Bible offers for confronting or thinking about the contemporary ecological crisis?
Mm-hmm. The Bible, I think, does offer resources. It has sometimes been part of the problem, and sometimes I think figures as part of the solution. There has been, I think, a persistent misuse of some of the Bible, the notion of course, what it means for human beings to have dominion over the earth. And those issues have been, I think, discussed thoroughly. And it certainly does not mean that people have the right to simply exploit the earth as a resource. Instead, whatever dominion means, it has to be looked at in terms of the way in which the Bible models what good kingship means, and that means protecting the whole. But some of the less obvious passages, I think, are useful in terms of the again, the wisdom literature, I think, even though it almost never talks explicitly about ecological issues, if you look at the thought structure of wisdom literature, it's very much like ecological thinking. That is, actions have consequences. Things are part of a system, so that an effect, something done here will have an effect over there. A sense of balance, harmony, an underlying logic, which if you cooperate with it, creates flourishing, and which if you try to act greedily or selfishly against it, it creates disasters. So most people don't bring the Book of Proverbs into thinking about environmental issues, but if you look at it, the sense of ancient wisdom really does have a very ecological structure to it.
Yeah, and you applied that same kind of wisdom thinking to Genesis 2 and 3, which are also infused with wisdom themes. And I thought you raised a good point in a paper that you gave called Hope in a Time of Climate Change, a conversation between Bible and the science. And you say that in light of the current ecological crisis, one of the questions that poses itself is, how could we have been so foolish? It's not just the kind of sin and wickedness angle on the ecological problem, but also the folly of humankind. And so how does Genesis 2 and 3 also give you a vantage point on the question of human foolishness toward the planet?
Well, one of the reason that I got interested in that was I'm a bit of a human anthropology buff. And so I love reading about the origins of the human species. And one of the things that in recent work they looked at this sort of creative explosion that seems to take place. The dates are a little debated, but maybe 100,000 years ago. And it's usually associated with the rise of symbolic thinking among humans. You begin to see the first evidences of markings that may represent symbolic representation. And so something shifts in the human cognitive capacity. Maybe it's associated with the origins of language. It's very difficult to tell, and things are still exploratory. But all of a sudden, boom, you seem to get human migration across the globe, and the pace of technological change starts increasing exponentially. So something happens in our species which had been much more stable for hundreds of thousands of years before, and then all of a sudden, boom. And so I was looking back at Genesis 2 to 3, and I thought, this is actually an evolutionary story, because at the beginning of Genesis 2, when God creates the earth creature, the Adam, and then decides to make a companion for it, God simply makes other animals. That is, there is no differentiation. By the end of the story, you're going to have three species. You're going to have divine beings, you're going to have animals, and you're going to have humans. So the ancients were puzzling over this same, how do humans emerge? And is it accidental or fortuitous that humans emerge? And what more than that, in the Genesis story, of course, our becoming, quote, like gods, has to do with this difference in cognitive capacity that separates us from the other animals. And Genesis says, this had some good consequences and some not so good consequences. And I thought, wow, that strikes me as very similar to what anthropologists describe when they're talking about this rapid change of humans, which not only has incredible, exciting changes associated with it, but you also start to track environmental degradation that follows the path.
Yeah, I think you put it rather well in the paper, where you were talking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you said about God-likeness. Why didn't God want us to have this capacity? Well, actually, the story is rather ambivalent about that. The tree was off limits, but it was right there within reach. And narratives of this type that begin with a prohibition have a plot structure that requires that the prohibition be breached. Pandora is going to look in that box. Adam and Eve are going to eat from the tree, but the prohibition has a serious function in the story. The divine capacity was marked as off limits to us because we are not, in fact, gods. We are not equipped to handle this capacity wisely. We are this anomalous creature. We are both splendid and very, very dangerous. And I think the rest of the story from Genesis 3 to 6 shows this unfolding in terms of violence, but also technological developments that accompany the growth of humankind as they spread throughout the world, and that there's a kind of moral ambivalence about the technologies that humans develop.
Yes, and I think that there's an awareness of that in these narratives. You do see the well, especially in Genesis. In the sequence, of course, in Genesis 4, we have the murder. Genesis 5 does give us the accounts of a number of new technological developments, metalworking, music, herding, etc., even the development of religion. And so I think that the ancients, we know that in Greece, similarly, as in Israel, there was a real reflection on the fact that humans create extraordinary things, but also are involved in very distressing patterns of violence. And so this meditation on both the glories and the horrors of what it means to be human is, I think, just about as ancient as the species is. So we've been self-aware.
Which sounds like the kind of thinking that you get in Kohelet as well, where there's this idea that sometimes humans can make extraordinary things. They can develop planes, but sometimes those planes drop bombs on us.
Yes,
and there's a kind of concern about that. So I want to go back just for a moment real quick to Genesis 1, because as you mentioned, Genesis 1 often gets misused in this discussion. It is seen as a part of the problem in human exploitation of the earth. But is there a place for the notion of dominion and rule in an environmental sense?
Yes, I think there is. A movement in deep ecology tends to see human beings as simply the problem, which I certainly can understand how how one comes to that conclusion. Nevertheless, humans, for better or worse, are here, and if whatever going forward is going to be done to ensure a balance and to ensure that there are places that allow for the healthy ecosystems, it's going to require human intentional actions. And action, by action, I sometimes mean also keeping hands off. That is, allowing wild places to be wild. But because humans now have so much extraordinary power, then it's simply a fact that humans do have dominion. And the question is how to make that wise dominion.
Yeah. And I think some even the violent imagery of subduing comes into play when you have a problem like kudzu taking over the South, where you need some humans to go, and with some goats as they use sometimes, but to go in there and yank that stuff out.
Yeah.
And I think there's I doubt that's what Genesis 1 had in mind, but as we kind of reread those texts in light of the ecological crisis, I think there is a place for that, even the stronger sense of subjugation when used in conjunction with an overarching environmental care.
Right. And of course, to do anything wisely and well requires a sense of what goodness looks like. And a sense of what flourishing looks like, which is, why I keep coming back to that sense that the wisdom literature itself, particularly in the Book of Proverbs, has that sense that you can't talk about the good in isolation from relationships. Everything is in relationship to everything else. And so any vision of the good is going to be that deep wisdom which understands the interconnectedness of all. And that's a fundamental ecological principle.
Okay, we're going to change course now. And to effect this transition, we're going to do a speed round where I ask a question and you have 15 seconds to develop your answer.
Okay.
All right. If you had a theme song for your life, what would it be?
I'd have to make up a song title. I guess maybe Girls Just Want to Have Fun. How about that? Intellectual fun, that is.
That sounds good. Who's the greatest jazz musician of all time?
Duke Ellington.
Okay. When God, okay, here's a question about Job. When God said that Job had spoken rightly about him, was he referring back to his previous statement that he had just made, or to the entirety of Job's speeches?
Actually, I think it's neither one. I think it's like a bad cut in a movie, and you think, what? What's that referring to? It's a bad cut.
Yeah. All right. Well, I like that one. All right. Do you have a favorite palindrome?
Able I was ere I saw Elba, a man, a plan, a canal, Panama. Aren't those palindromes, or do I get that confused?
Oh, wow. Hey, I can't do palindromes quickly enough in my head, but I'm going to take that. That was impressive.
It's the same before,
okay.
Backwards and backwards, both of those will work.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. When's the last time you rode a carousel?
I was probably in my early 20s. I went to a state fair in Western Massachusetts and had a ball.
All right, you're coming up on retirement. So what hobbies do you hope to pick up or develop?
Ooh, I've taken up weaving, and I have taken up the lamp work glass beads, which involves fire, molten glass, and a lot of fun.
Oh, wow. I feel like we need more than 15 seconds on this. So the weaving as in like not a weaving loom, not basket weaving?
Right,
so...
yes. I have a floor loom.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And are you using Iron Age loom weights?
No, although I really have gotten interested now. There's a wonderful book called Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years, and it's a history of weaving. So it tells some of those ancient techniques.
Oh, I had a chance to dig at Tel Bernat in the Shvela, and I dug up a loom weight. I was pretty excited about it. All right. And then the glass bead, what does that mean?
You take glass rods and melt them and shape them around steel rods coated with clay, and then decorate them with different colors. So anytime you've got molten glass and high temperatures and pretty colors, it's exciting. I burned my finger last week. So.
and I assume you wear eye protection?
Yes. You have to be careful about your eyes and about your lungs because there are fumes that come from this.
And you just do that in your microwave, I'm sure, right?
No, right now I have to go to a studio, but I have plans for putting in a home studio if I really get serious about it. But I highly recommend it.
Amazing. Okay, all right. Where do you hope to travel?
Well, as soon as my last classes are out, we're going to be heading off to New Zealand, which is one of my favorite places in the whole world.
All right, let's say that once you've retired, you had the ambition to start a company. What company would it be? It
would be a handicrafts company. I really like the revival of craft working, and I think that would be something to encourage.
Yeah, I have to say, I recently, actually just this week, I had 5 kilograms of willow withies delivered to my house because I picked up basket weaving.
Oh, right.
so Abby, my wife, bought some willow at a craft fair, brought it home. It sat there for like 6 months, and then we just made baskets, and it was so much fun. So we're going for it.
All right, I'll represent you.
All right, cats or dogs?
Oh, dogs.
Okay. Of what achievement are you most proud?
Well, to be serious, the opportunity to bring back one of the Dead Sea Scrolls to make it available to people, that's probably the thing that has made me happiest in terms of contributions.
Excellent. All right, in one sentence, can you sell me on an Atlanta summer?
Even if it's hot and dry, the eggplant grow beautifully.
What's the most provocative or challenging book that you've read recently?
That is difficult. I read the Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses Grant. And since I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, we didn't hear much good about Ulysses Grant. He's a fascinating guy.
Okay. Now, what's something surprising that the Old Testament has to say about women?
Women can be as violent as men.
Okay.
Yael was one of my heroines when I was a small child because I was quite attracted to seeing women act violently.
And so did you have like a picture of Yael in action on your wall?
No, but I do remember one from the Bible story book. So she and Deborah made quite a pair.
Yeah. What's one idea in biblical studies that you think needs to die?
that we can reverse engineer how the Bible was written. That is to say, I think redaction theories get far too complicated. We know it happened, but I don't think you can reverse engineer it very often, in very much detail.
Okay, well, I'll let you take that up with the Germans. All right, I'd like to shift gears to briefly here at the end to talk about some of your current work on the genealogy of the self and moral anthropology in ancient Israel. And those two ideas might be a head scratcher for some of our listeners. So I'm wondering if you could explain what genealogy of the self means and how you're thinking about it.
Yeah. One of the things that people have realized for some time is that our sense of self, which we sort of take for granted, actually is culturally and historically specific. That is the way, one of the things that we realize, I think this is fairly easy to see, is that Westerners do tend to have a slightly different sense of the self than, say, people from China or Japan. Now, that contrast can be overly drawn, but Westerners, we tend, at least if people ask us what's a self, we tend to describe it in rather individualistic terms. And if you ask people from Oriental cultures, they are much more likely to describe it in interdependent or sort of social terms. So there are these differences, and people have also realized that there's a history to development of understandings of the self. Taylor wrote this extraordinary book, Sources of the Self, trying to give a genealogy of the modern Western self. So I began to get interested in how we think about, or how the ancient Israelites think about the self, and it struck me that there are indications of some significant changes that happen between the period of the First Kingdom and then the period of Second Temple Judaism. And I got interested in seeing if I could tease out some of those.
And your primary sources for thinking about that, are you looking at the entire Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature to kind of look at broad trends, or are you working in specific texts?
Well, fortunately, a good deal of work has been done on the sort of the basic ancient, what we think of biblical sense. And one of the things that people noticed is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of introspection. There doesn't seem to be a lot of sense of inner conflict, a divided self. The sort of things that, if you were going to really contrast it, you would say, oh yeah, during the Romantic period in 19th century Europe or whatever, you have these agonized, tortured, internally divided self. But even if you look at the Puritans, the way they did self-examination and sort of they would name their faults, they would identify their struggling wills, and so on and so forth. Well, all of a sudden I thought, then how do you go from one to the other? And even already in Paul, you do have some indications in Paul that there is a sense of a divided self. So I thought, I wonder if I can close in on finding some of the places where you start to see this idea develop. And I think you can find these.
And, in graduate school, I read the famous article by Christopher Stendhal called The Apostle Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West. And I can't remember the details of that too well, but I think he sort of says that we often read back into Paul this idea of a plagued conscience, and that actually doesn't develop until much later.
And this is one of the real debates, exactly. But we know that by the time you get to someone like Augustine, you've you've got that. But are we retrojecting Luther? Are we retrojecting Augustine into Paul? And there was, I think, Stendhal's article has some really good insights. In some respects, though, the aftermath of that article has gone too far in the other direction. And you get this sort of weirdly exotic notion that, that they had no ability to for self-examination, self-consideration. And more recent scholarship, I'd say over the past 10 years, has really started shifting now in another direction. Most interesting couple of, one by Susan Eastman, just came out this year, called Paul and the Person, Reframing Paul's Anthropology. And she goes in to look at, what are the models of personhood in Paul, and she puts some conversations with contemporary experimental psychology, modern neuroscience, and so on and so forth. So I think we're starting to find a new discourse about the self in antiquity that's more nuanced than we've had, and which perhaps finds that middle way between anachronistic views and sort of weirdly exotic views of the self. Hope so, anyway.
Right. Yeah, and by weirdly exotic, you're saying that we describe Paul and his contemporaries as so different that they had no notion of interiority or a self that they could examine. That there's an utter disjunction.
Yeah, and so I think that's carrying cultural difference too far, because basically to be successful human beings, we all have to have certain capacities for recognizing internal conflicts of conflicting desires or motives. We have to have certain basic equipment. Now, the difference is sometimes culture latches onto those and says, "Woo," and develops those. That's where I think you see real differences between cultures, and over time is that certain things become thematically interesting to a culture. And so a culture may decide to turn and find that sense of inner conflict productive, interesting, and develop it. And you do start to see that in Second Temple Judaism, although the nature of that cultural construct of the self is going to be quite different from what you're seeing over in the developing philosophical discourses in Greece. That's something, so they may be both, we might describe them both generally as developing this introspective potential, but they're going to be quite culturally different too.
Yeah, and so as it's becoming a more of a cultural preoccupation, what's the nature of that internal struggle as it takes shape in the Qumran literature that might differ from the Old Testament and also differ from how moderns tend to think about the internal struggles that we might have?
Well, one of the things that I notice is, and I don't want to oversimplify because there's a lot of different developments that are going on in Persian period Judaism, but the one little angle that I've been following here is it really, I think, related to how to deal with the trauma of the fall of Jerusalem and Judah in 587. Because this had been set up in Deuteronomistic language and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, etc., as basically a moral fault on the part of the people. They knew what they should do, they failed to do what they should do. And so in the aftermath, if you're looking back and you're thinking, why did we fail? And even more so looking forward, is it possible not to fail in the future? Then people, there is a kind of, where does the problem come from and what's the solution? And you see in Ezekiel already, Ezekiel has a very negative view of the people. And basically, you have to take away that heart of stone. You got to put in a heart of flesh. And also, God puts God's spirit into the people. And so you will be able to follow my laws. So the sense of something fundamentally defective in the human mind or heart is, that's a fairly new idea. And then you begin to see it sort of creeping into individual psalmic poetry. Psalm 51, create in me a new heart, O God, drawing on Ezekiel. So here's a person who at prayer sort of considering himself, not just saying, save me, O Lord, but transform me, O Lord, because there's something radically defective about me. And so that's a moment in which you see the speaking voice turns its attention on itself. I'm not simply a whole being saying, save me. I'm looking into myself. Save me from myself. That's different. And then you begin to see, how does it show up in Qumran? Oh, they have this notion of two spirits struggling within the body of a person in the two spirits teaching. Or you see in the Hodayot, the Thanksgiving Psalms, this concern that a spirit of perversion rules over me. Well, how do you know that a spirit of perversion rules over you? And in some sense, then again, they're asking for transformation of the self because they're so disturbed by a sense of something radically wrong within oneself. Those are new things.
Yeah, and is that so? That is even different from what you see in the Cain and Abel story, where prior to killing his brother, Cain is warned that there's a sin is lying or crouching at the door, and he's got to master it. So how would it be different from that kind of internal struggle? Is it the fundamental nature of it, or are there other differences?
I do think that those that the Genesis narratives are probably also an early stage of this development. Now there you still have that sin is crouching. It seems to be an externalized force. If you look at how notions of the demonic start to change at this same period, in most of ancient world, what do demons do? Their job portfolio involves causing illness and death. Demons are not interested in your moral nature. That's not their job. But you start to see the demonic as a moral threat at exactly the same period of time. Possibly in some of the Enochic materials, but very clearly in the Book of Jubilees. They lead you astray. That's not what Mesopotamian demons do. So we're getting this same sense that alienation can either be seen as internal, it's my heart that's the problem, or external, it's this demon that wants to influence my moral will. And those are just two sort of complementary ways of describing the same anxiety.
And the other interesting point you made in one of your articles was that there's also this idea that the cosmic conflict that was previously external between good and evil was now taking place within oneself.
Yes, and you see that very clearly in the Qumran Two Spirits treatise, where what is a kind of dualistic conflict between two principles, light and darkness, or what you could see in terms of angelic figures, the Prince of Light and the Angel of Darkness. You can also then see as being internal the spirit of light or darkness that operates at the level of human psychology. So all of this is sort of homologous throughout cosmic and personal, which one of the things that results from that is that then what we think of as moral struggles take on this great seriousness, because in resisting that sense of evil, I'm somehow resisting something that has cosmic significance as well.
So, Carol, is the development of the moral self your next major monograph project, or what else do you have on the horizon?
Yeah, no, I am. That is what I'm working on right now, and hope to finish that up in a year or so. Then I also am working on a commentary on the Hodayot, the Thanksgiving songs from Qumran. And so that fits in quite nicely since those are important texts for the question of the self.
And all this between weaving and glass bead artwork, right?
Yes. Trying to get the balance right between work and play, but...
Yeah, that's good. Well, Carol, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with OnScript, and on behalf of your listeners, but also and especially your current and former students, I want to say how much we appreciate you.
Oh, well, thank you. And it's just been a real pleasure. You're a wonderful interviewer and have made this a much less intimidating process than I was afraid it might be.
Oh, thank you.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.